Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. Over the last two series, we've been talking to academics and practitioners about research, impact and advocacy in the area of human rights. In this series, we've focused on the struggle to end modern slavery. I'm Zoe Trodd, Director of the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, and in today's special season finale, we're discussing human rights and development approaches to modern slavery. My guest is your regular Rights Track host, Todd Landman, Professor of Political Science and Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Nottingham. Also Executive Director of the Rights Lab, a university beacon of excellence focused on research to help end slavery by 2030. Welcome, Todd. It's great to have the chance to interview you on this special episode of the Rights Track. So you're working on the problem of modern slavery, and in particular you've done analysis of global slavery data, of anti-slavery monitoring and evaluation and impact assessment, but you've also worked for 25 years in the area of human rights and development and democracy. You've shown that human rights advocacy can be advanced really through the systematic analysis of data combined with legal analysis, and you've drawn on disciplinary tools from economics, from international relations, from political science. And maybe your most well-known research involves the quantitative analysis of human rights. So I want to start by asking you actually to defend that focus on measurement and on models. People don't live quantitative lives, they lead qualitative lives. So why does quant analysis matter to human rights? Why does it matter to anti-slavery in particular?
So I think you're absolutely right that people live qualitative lives, but that doesn't mean that aspects of their life can't be quantified. And the main strength of quantification is that you're taking something that is what Charles Reagan called something quite fuzzy or woolly, and you're adding a little bit of precision to it. And there is a subjective moment when you do that, when you take something qualitative and you code it into something quantitative. But if the coding procedure is followed properly, if it's defended and it's transparent and can be replicated by others, then I think it's a good move that can be made. And what it allows is comparison across large groups of individuals. And as soon as you're able to do that, you're able to scale up across large numbers of people, then you can look for patterns. You can look for differences between particular groups of people. You can look for differences across their attributes. And if you're doing things at the country level, you aggregate those measures up to country level. You can compare across countries, space, and time, and again, look for patterns. And then, in addition to looking for patterns, you're able to look for empirical relationships between important variables. So those attributes of people or countries become variables which can then be compared and contrasted. And then you can find empirical generalizations. So you can actually draw conclusions and say, if this goes up, that goes down, or generally we know if these are going up, those are going down, and that requires us to look further at that relationship.
What does this then mean for this research field of modern slavery? So as you know, this as a field, it's maybe 20 years old. It began in earnest, I think, with our colleague Kevin Bales' book, Disposable People, in 1999. But arguably, as a really serious, vibrant field that would include this kind of analysis, it's maybe been consolidating for about 8 years. So it's a young field, and that's compared to the human rights field. We see that in the fact, we host here the first MA on slavery and liberation. There's still no high-quality journal on modern slavery. There's no PhD program. Whereas, of course, there are PhD programs on human rights, including at your previous institution, Essex. Mm-hmm. And there are some high-quality journals in the field of human rights that date back to at least the 1980s. So this focus that you bring of quant analysis, what does that possibly mean for this brand new field of modern slavery?
The quantitative analysis in human rights is also quite new. The first measures were developed in the late 1970s, early 1980s. With the exception of one really important study that was done in 1935 about violence after the French Revolution and the use of execution. Someone actually did spreadsheets and did a mapping of violence in France, which is absolutely fascinating. And in one of my books, I actually use it as an early example of human rights measurement. But human rights measurement itself is still quite young, and the first large-N quantitative study of human rights variation was done by Neil Mitchell and Jim McCormick in 1988 in World Politics, right? So it's still quite young. Yeah. And there are shared features across modern slavery and human rights. So these are practices that are hard to see. They're hard to find populations of people and hard to find acts between people. So some of the techniques that have been developed over the years in human rights, the so-called who did what to who model that we've been discussing on this program, is particularly apt for trying to find hard to find populations and behaviors. Scalar data and survey data and socioeconomic statistics and proxy measures and big data and all those sorts of techniques that are available for human rights are equally available for modern slavery. The key thing to always keep in mind is that whenever there's a hard-to-find population or hard-to-find practice, any type of quantitative effort is going to come with measurement error, and it's going to come with a hell of a lot of uncertainty in the ways in which those measures are developed, and you have to be super cautious in the statements that you make.
What else then? I take all that on board. What else could this field be learning from the field of human rights? And I'm asking that in particular because it is the case, and I'm sure you know this, that the first ever human rights journal was published by abolitionists. It was a 4-page journal called Human Rights. It was published from 1835 to 1839 by the American Anti-Slavery Society. It actually circulated tens of thousands of copies a week. Some scholars have suggested that abolitionism was the first human rights movement, that abolitionists were the first activists who really formulated a comprehensive human rights framework. But for a long time, this field of modern slavery studies has been dominated by just a criminal justice approach, and that's been a focus on human trafficking as organised crime. And that's been the case in practice as well. So NGOs and governments focus a lot on how to rescue victims, how to bring perpetrators to justice. Then you've got another silo, which is the International Labour Organization, making it a labour rights issue and often working in isolation from the human trafficking field. Only recently, with the Sustainable Development Goals, has slavery become perhaps a development issue, not just criminal justice and labour rights. But I do think there is still too little cross-fertilisation between modern slavery scholars and practitioners and human rights ones. So what I really want to know, I suppose, is what does a human rights approach to modern slavery look like?
So there have been similar evolutions in the human rights field. There's been a lot of development around human rights law, and that involves jurisprudence and advocacy for more and more rights being codified through law. So there was a kind of rights expansion problem from original civil and political rights conceptions and economic, social, cultural rights conceptions to many more rights being added to this collection of rights. And various attempts to enumerate the number of rights that actually find themselves in legal protection. As you know, the work I did in a book a number of years ago is we think there are about 63 human rights currently protected, but there are others who always want to add new rights to the list. So I think this notion of listing things is interesting, and where slavery fits in that is actually quite underdeveloped. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done around the jurisprudence around slavery, and I would argue even more forcefully precise definitions of what constitutes slavery and the different dimensions. And I think some of the work in human rights around state obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill really applies to modern slavery. So this idea that there are things that states can do that do not violate rights, the things that states could do to protect the violation of rights by others, and that's where slavery really fits. If you imagine third-party violation of human rights with respect to modern slavery, that's a real area of work that human rights could look at. And then around fulfillment, in terms of providing the social and economic conditions for a fulfilling life full of robust human dignity. Again, states have an obligation to provide things like education, welfare, social care, and fair labor protections. So interestingly, the discourse on slavery tends to focus on a civil and political rights violation, a crime against humanity, and you have freedom from servitude, freedom from slavery. You don't have strong human rights advocacy around fair conditions, fair working conditions, etc. It focuses on trafficking and the crime of trafficking, but not about government provision of things that prevent people falling into slavery. And I think there's a lot of human rights work that could be done on that. But one of the key developments, at least in the sort of social science of human rights, is that it moved away from a primary focus on law and started to say, what could the other disciplines bring to our understanding of human rights? And so two communities that were often in opposition to one another started to find common ground. So I remember going to a European convention years ago, a conference in Brussels on human rights and statistics. And you had human rights people who were really focusing on individual cases, law, advocacy, jurisprudence, etc. And you had statisticians looking at macro patterns, and the two never spoke to each other. In fact, they were quite in opposition. At one point, someone said, "Isn't it undignified and offensive to use statistics to study human rights?" But in some way, there's been a kind of, for lack of a better word, a kind of eucatastrophe, if you will, that combined these two communities together, that where they found common ground to talk about those issues that could be done looking where you combine law and statistics. And I think a similar conversation is taking place in the study of modern slavery. So again, there's lots of arguments about legal definitions and the boundary conditions of slavery, what constitutes slavery, what is it, where is it when we see it, etc. And how do we take that concept and operationalize it for social science research? So the work we discussed things with Kevin Bales about the Global Slavery Index. There's work on the who did what to whom model being applied to slavery. There's multiple systems estimations looking at multiple lists of things that are reported and compared and looking at the overlaps, etc. Those are all techniques that have been developed on other types of human rights problems, in particular civilian casualties in conflict and torture, disappearance, etc. So I think there's great crossover there between the two communities. The final piece is one which combines rigorous research with advocacy. So human rights scholars tend to study human rights because they're motivated by problems they see they want to fix in the world. So they're not sort of neutral observers of the world. They are actually active researchers that are trying to fix a problem. And typically with the modern slavery people that I've been interacting with, they're abolitionists. So does that color their objectivity when they are researching a problem? And I think there's a really fantastic sort of philosophical, ethical, epistemological problem that we as scholars have to deal with in looking at real world problems and wanting to change them, while at the same time remaining as objective as possible when we analyze differences and sort of contradictions in the world.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you. You mentioned a couple different times, and I want to go back to it, the definitional question. I do agree with you that it's key. Could you just reflect a little bit more as a human rights scholar on that debate about what constitutes slavery? And you flagged that debate just now, the problem of establishing these boundary conditions and indicators, and just suggest, if you would, what is the way forward through that debate, and what might scholars have been missing as they seek to explain the meaning, really, of the term modern slavery?
Well, like many concepts in human rights, the definitions are contested. That doesn't mean they're contestable. It just means they're contested. It means there will always be competing views of what things are. And even within something as simple as we say, torture, that's got to be well defined legally. It is, but there's an entire handbook on how to report torture as a human rights violation. And that handbook was funded by the Foreign Office. It was produced by Nigel Rodley and a team of researchers at University of Essex. It's been translated into numerous languages, and it's about 200 pages long. And that's just for one quote-unquote human rights violation we call torture. And, the debates in the US, waterboarding is not torture. Waterboarding is torture. What are the boundary conditions of a concept that certain practices would fall within those boundary conditions or not. And modern slavery is absolutely open to a similar contestation. So the literature I've been reading is a sort of a serious concern that either it's too narrow, it doesn't include all these other things, or it's too wide and therefore you're getting huge numbers when you try to count it. So there needs to be some consensus reached. My own personal reflections have led me to this idea of agency, individual agency. So from a whole long line of social science literature on structure and agency, rational models of the economy are based on some sense of freedom and agency, and yet structuralists and those that look at broader patterns in society suggest that we're constrained in some way in the freedom of the sorts of things that we're able to do. And Michael Ignatieff has written very much on these lines, that human rights in some ways protect our agency. They allow us to have that freedom, but equally allow us to contest injustice, and they empower us and allow us to contest where we think injustices are taking place. And that protection of agency is absolutely crucial to a human rights understanding of human activity in a free society. If we then allow that to sort of travel to the concept of slavery, it seems to me that what we're really trying to understand is what is the intentional denial of agency of another, right? So what is it that someone is doing to someone else where their agency is severely curtailed? So if I look at all the definitions going back to the 1926 convention all the way up to the Bellagio-Harvard guidelines, there's a focus on property, control, coercion, as if people were property. There's an extension in the Bellagio-Harvard guidelines. That as if phrase is quite powerful, because when we see slavery today, we don't see people bound in chains. We don't have slave ships. There were people bound in chains in Libya for sale, etc. But that's an unusual quite overt case of modern slavery, whereas it's much more subtle. The control mechanisms are not as obvious. You can see people do block pavings in streets in Britain, and you wouldn't say, oh, there's a group of slaves. And yet, if you went up and talked to those people, their passports might be held. They're not free to leave the place of employ. They're not being paid at all, and they're being held in a caravan at night where they can't go out and roam freely, etc. So, what is the relative degree in the denial of personal agency?
Yeah.
Who's doing that denial, and is it coercive in any way? So is there an intentional denial of that agency? So it's quite plausible that someone could live in an otherwise free society where everyone else has agency, and there's protection of rule of law, there's democracy, there's elections, etc., and yet a subset of the population are having their agency completely and utterly denied. So at a micro level of agency, that denial of agency is almost a necessary and sufficient condition that has to be in place that puts you into the threshold of, you're beyond the threshold of modern slavery.
Yes.
Whereas others would say, we're all trapped in the big capitalist machine and therefore we're all slaves to the modern economy. But I would suggest that undervalues the maltreatment of some people that we would say are in modern slavery. And we need to focus on the intentional denial of agency, not the sort of relative agency that we all have within a modern capitalist society.
So it's clear to me how all of that is infused with your own background on human rights scholarship and advocacy to a certain extent. Can we pivot slightly to thinking about slavery as a development issue? But you did touch on this earlier when you were starting to think about freedom from servitude versus governments providing the conditions for human well-being. Slavery was absent from the Millennium Development Goals, as you know, but since 2015 it's been part of the UN's new Sustainable Development Goals, and that was a huge moment, target 8.7. So how is slavery potentially an issue of human and economic development?
So I'm going to start with the counterintuitive argument. Slavery historically and traditionally was a great way to develop a country. If you just take it at a kind of face value perspective. So if you look at ancient Greek societies, you look at Roman society, if you're going to go colonize the world and build stuff, it's great to conscript slaves. If you conquer another country in war, you, as the victor of the spoils, get the people to you enslave the enemy's victims, right? And they can build you bridges, they can dig rivers, they can build houses, and they become a workforce that you then exploit. And if you look at the American transatlantic slave trade, the South was developed because of slavery. It was an economically viable model of development. And the plantation economy itself, was broken apart by the Civil War. And there's a whole Marxist analysis that suggests the Civil War was really about two incompatible economic systems. The North was based on a small agrarian model with individual landholders trying to, sort of build their family units, etc. And the South was very much a regal system, which was a large plantations with enslaved populations that were servicing the land in a different model. And that incompatibility between those two systems inevitably broke out in the Civil War. So some people say that wasn't really about slavery, it was just about incompatible economic systems. What we do know is that slavery was profitable in history. And therefore the use of another in that sense was actually a tool for economic development. Industrialization changes that because you have a shift from the agrarian production to industrial production. And, leftists and Marxists would argue that workers became the new slaves to capitalism because, again, their freedom was denied, they were exploited, their surplus value was exploited, etc. So if we then move forward, there's abolition, the Civil War ends, there's the Emancipation Proclamation, etc., the Civil Rights Movement, etc. We could talk endlessly about the Civil Rights Movement in the U.S. and the inadequacies of the response to the Civil War and all the problems that are affecting America today. But if we focus on slavery itself, it turns out that the drive to the bottom, the race to the bottom around the production of consumer goods, textiles, manufactured goods, etc., and the rapid expansion of the human population has actually reduced the price of a person to one of the lowest prices in human history. And therefore, there's still a very strong economic incentive to engage in slavery if you're a slaveholder, right, in whatever form. Certainly the interview with Austin Choi Fitzpatrick made visible how that works in certain contexts, particularly the Indian context. Yet, I think if you think about 40 million plus who are enslaved in the world, according to some estimates, that can be a drag on economic development because those people are not being used as productively as possible. They're not engaging in a free exchange of labor in the sense they're selling their labor just like any other worker would on the market. They have collective bargaining rights, they have union rights, they have free speech and assembly rights. They don't have any of those things. With those things in place, you can guarantee wages, you can have minimum wages, you can have the living wage, you can articulate demands against the state to get a fair shake of national the fruits of that development.
And you also have wages you can invest and buy kids food with and put into your local community instead of that wage being stolen by slaveholders.
Yeah, so at a household level, you have the microcredit to develop and reproduce your family, etc., and to actually advance in society. So from whatever level of poverty one might be. So a lot of studies on microcredit show just by giving someone a mobile phone could actually change the fortunes of that family. Just by giving them a horse or a donkey or a mule, that then becomes an asset from which they can then develop. And I think there are analogies there that if you liberate people from a system of enslavement, then that empowerment, just that little bit of liberation, is going to make a fruitful difference for them. But I think one of the challenges is if you just liberate people and chuck them out of slavery, what happens? You need a support mechanism, you need an initial investment, you need a package that they're rescued with so that they actually get a viable means of survival. Because, if you liberate someone, they might fall right back into slavery very quickly.
I want to jump from that and, if you're willing, have a pretty quick fire conversation as part of this episode. I'm introducing it as a new element and get your thoughts on the Rights Lab's 4 main questions. And this is in terms of methodological progress. So we built the lab around these questions. We've been active for a year, and of course we're aiming for evidence-based answers to these questions over the coming years. We're aiming for this Freedom Blueprint and Action Plan for the global community by 2022. But I would like just to do a litmus test on where we are with these from your perspective. So not actual answers to these questions, but about how we might answer these going forward. So what you think are some of the methods for answering them that show promise so far. So question 1 for the Rights Lab: how many slaves are there in the world and where are they?
It's a measurement question, and it is down to a multiple use of multiple measures using the best combinatory techniques that we have. Certainly combinations of various quantitative techniques that have been used for measuring the prevalence of human rights violations more generally, but there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done precisely around definition, operationalization, generating indicators. The work I've done with the United Nations around this was about 2 or 3 years engagement with the Office of the High Commissioner in Geneva, right by right. I think we did 4 or 5 rights a year. So it's a really long, hard thinking process that needs to be done around definition and operationalization. And then you may find that there simply are no data, that they're just not available. And then you need to think about what are your proxy measures, what are the sorts of things, risk factors and other things that might be related to the probability of people falling into slavery. So it may not be direct measurement. It just may not be direct. I think the work we've done on geospatial analysis is really cool because you're counting things where you know there's a high probability of slavery. You're not counting slavery. So Doreen Boyd's work on brick kilns, for example, there are 55,000 brick kilns estimated in that brick belt region, and we know that 60 to 70% of them probably have some form of slavery happening in them. So that's a very distant statement about actually measuring the prevalence. It's a statement about, we think that high prevalence is in this region precisely because we've mapped all these brick kilns. And I'm really comfortable with that because that's getting closer to the question than anyone's ever been before.
Question 2, why does slavery persist?
So there are a number of structural and endemic factors in all modern societies where the opportunity to be a slaveholder is large, the price of a person is low, the structural incentives for someone to engage in illegal activity is still high in many countries. The legal institutions, corruption, lack of accountability just the sheer size of a country. I mean, Congo is massive and has no infrastructure. So you can actually just get away with it because no one sees you. So there's an opportunity to do illegal activities simply because no one can see you. And that drives persistence, right? There are incentives across the world for people to engage in this activity.
And because you are now doing what you were told not to do, which is actually answering the questions very impressively, do you also want to suggest of the sort of methods that you've seen us attempt so far, which of those show promise for answering this question about why slavery persists? I mean, I'm thinking back over the episodes you've recorded, and of course it's the ones with Bernard Silverman and Doreen Boyd this season that answer that first question, thinking a little bit about the amazing conversation you had with Andrea and Min, some of the techniques they might be interested in using to answer that why question.
So there are three approaches that I would look to, and apologies for having answered the question that I wasn't supposed to answer. So there are sort of rational, structural, and cultural approaches to understanding social phenomena. We need all of them. So, and I think there's been a dearth of economic analysis on this. So what are the economic incentives that make slavery persist? That's my question. Secondly, what are the structural conditions that allow slavery to persist? Weakness of institutions, class relations, etc. And then what are the cultural reasons for why it persists? Why do people look the other way? Why does it become normalized? Why, does Austin tell me about villages in India where someone points to his or her slaveholder saying, well, that's my enslaver, right? And they're just sitting in the same village circle because that culture has in some way normalized that practice. So I would start to look at the structural, the economic or rational basis for these things, and then also the cultural framings of how this is still seen as acceptable.
Yes. And question 3, and thinking about some of the methodological approaches that you think have promised, what works to tackle slavery?
So I still think we need to map who's doing what.
Yeah.
We don't have a good grip of how many NGOs there are and what they're actually doing. We need to understand why they think what they're doing actually does work. They might be doing a whole bunch of stuff that has no bearing whatsoever or have absolutely zero impact on eradicating the problem. By comparing across different interventions more systematically and understanding this worked in this context, will it work in another context? So that's structured comparative analysis of interventions that are successful against interventions that are unsuccessful. One of the biggest problems in human rights is you find people only comparing the successful movements. We need to look at unsuccessful against successful, so that stepping back and saying I need a methodological, good scientific reason to compare a set of interventions, and I want success and unsuccessful, maybe some that were partially successful, so we get a full range of approaches to work out what it is that actually works in order to then come up with a rule book or a guidebook, if you will, for future interventions.
And then last question, question 4, some of the methods for thinking about what difference freedom makes to the world. So what is the freedom dividend when people come into freedom?
Probably one of the hardest questions to ask, because it assumes there is a dividend, and you have to be prepared that the answer to that question is there might not be one. There might just be more misery and just a different form of it, right? I like to think that there probably is a dividend, but I would need markers for what that might look like. And I would need to understand what is the connection between liberation and that dividend. And I think a direct relation between liberation and dividend would be super hard to demonstrate. There's all sorts of claims that it would be immediate and easy to see, etc. But I think it's a really tricky methodological question to connect freeing an individual from a coercive form of labor to an aggregate betterment of society. I think that would be a really, really tricky thing to demonstrate. It's worth doing. But it again would take a lot of time in terms of specifying the way you were going to measure that, analyze that, compare that, and understand that.
And so one of the approaches that we've seen in this season is from your conversation with Alex Troutrams, and he of course has been trying to make the business case for anti-slavery, so making the case with corporations that it isn't just a moral argument for removing slavery from their supply chains, but it is one about much smoother, more transparent and better functioning supply chains when they're not tainted by slavery. And that's a way I think he's coming at that question of what the dividend might be. We're nearly out of time. I do want to finish, I suppose, by reflecting on the last year. So of course we've spent the last year since launching in June building the world's largest and leading group of modern slavery scholars here in the Rights Lab. There's been a lot of really exciting publications and partnerships and discoveries and podcast episodes. Could I ask you just to suggest 1 or 2 highlights for you of our work over the last year that maybe we haven't touched on yet?
I've really enjoyed the passion and the commitment of the people that I've spoken to, both on the podcast and not on the podcast. And every group that I meet are very, very passionate about what they're doing. They're very similar to the broader human rights community. There's always been a kind of deep moral commitment that people have, whether it comes from faith or from a secular source of morality, doesn't really matter. There is a kind of passion to help the other, and there's some sort of event in their life that had triggered that interest, which I find absolutely fascinating to meet people that have that commitment. I've really liked the innovative ways that different people are trying to get at this question. So whether it's from the sort of global slavery index to geospatial mapping to survivor narratives, there is this triangulation of ways of knowing the world, and I think that's really healthy, that plurality of understanding the world. And you know, the value that's placed on a single statement from a survivor, that's of equal value to a large data set, because it's just a rich form of data. It's just a different type of evidence, a different type of information. So I've really enjoyed that. I guess for me, the best thing that's happened this year, if I were to pick one, is probably the geospatial work, because I came to the University of Nottingham and I was really impressed with how comprehensive the university is. It's huge. You can do anything from archaeology to zoology here. And the walk down the hill to the Geospatial Institute, talking about Earth observation for the first time, and looking at the surprise in the faces of the people that run that institute when I said, have you ever used Earth observation to look at people? And they looked at me and said, no, we've never done that. And I said, well, we need to start doing that. And for Doreen Boyd in School of Geography and Kevin and others to pick up that idea and to say, what could we do with satellites that hadn't been done before? And I knew there were precedents. I knew that George Clooney had done this work in South Sudan. I knew that the American Association for Advancement of Science had been doing some stuff on the Russian invasion of Georgia, cross-border conflict. You can see buildup of tanks and all that kind of stuff. And the insight for me is when Stuart Marsh said to me, whenever there's a human activity on Earth, it's very highly probable that it will leave a trace. And I thought that's the entry point. So slavery leaves a trace. Slavery practices leaves a trace. Or activities around slavery will leave a human trace. What we need to do is to train our satellites, our images, and our machines that read those images to recognize those traces and do something with it. And that's precisely what Doreen's team had done with the brick kiln work. Not only that, but the fisheries in Bangladesh and some of the work in Brazil on charcoal. So for me, this combination of the high science of satellites and imagery, it all sounded eye in the skyish and a bit kind of military intelligence type approach, to ground truthing where these things were happening, and then using NGOs to liberate people from those sites of slavery. I think that's just a super way forward, and we've only just begun to use those technologies. I think there's a whole world waiting out there that could just be opened up beyond any of our imagination even a year ago.
Wonderful. So I want to thank you for the conversation today. I want to thank you for your work hosting this podcast and for researching modern slavery and human rights. I want to finish by asking you to flag, though, what listeners can expect from this podcast in the autumn.
So there are probably some more people we'd like to talk to that we're working with, certainly around monitoring and evaluation. Some of the work we've been doing with stakeholders, I think we could reach out to some of those people in government agencies that are trying to make a difference and talk to them. The agenda is very high in the UK political context, and I think we could do a lot more talking to stakeholders in that area. I would like to take the rights track on the road if all possible, and that means when people are out in the field that they will have an MP3 recorder with them, and we might be able to interview them while they're doing work in the field. So whenever our key people are out in Brazil or Tanzania or Africa somewhere, we can actually say, what is it you're doing, who are you meeting, what are you learning? I've been really interested in the work that churches do around the world. I think that's an underexplored area for us to look to. I'd like to talk to some of there's sort of very interesting sort of network of nuns that are doing very, very discreet, nuanced work with victims of slavery. Would love to get and talk with them. So there's a whole range of people I'd like to talk to around this issue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Zoe Trodd and produced by Christine Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more in our episode show notes at www.rightstrack.org and subscribe on the usual podcast platforms, including iTunes and Spotify. We'll be back in the autumn when we'll continue to have conversations that get our thinking about human rights on the right track.